So where we are then at this point in book two is that Spinoza has defined the human mind to be the idea of the human body. There's a perfect idea of the human body in God's mind under the parallelism between the attributes of thought and extension. What he's now going to explain in these propositions up to proposition 31 is why the ideas in our minds are inadequate or confused, or he also uses terms like mutilated or fragmented. And the principal reason for this, the germ of it, has already been covered in last week, where he says in the, I think it's the corollary to proposition 17, that our knowledge of bodies external to ourselves say more about the disposition of our own body than about the external bodies. And now he's going to elaborate on this at length, and I've selected the scholium to proposition 29 as a summary of all the ground that he's going to cover in this sequence of propositions. So here, the excerpts that I've chosen, they come from the Elwes translation. It just happens to be easier for me to navigate that than the Curley translation. But you'll find this in Curley at proposition 29. Essentially, he's just restating the corollary at proposition 29, but he really wants to drive home the point. So let me just read this. He says that the mind has not an adequate, but only a confused knowledge of itself, of its own body, and of external bodies whenever it perceives things after the common order of nature, that is, whenever it is determined from without, namely by the fortuitous play of circumstance, to regard this or that. Okay, so we have a problem from some quarter here. Oh, let me continue. Okay, so the problem is that we only know about bodies external to ourselves through the effects that those bodies have on our own body. So that means that we cannot have an adequate
Robert, I got
knowledge
something
of our
for
own
you,
body.
man.
Can we identify this? Okay, we can't have an adequate knowledge of our own body because our own body is not a substance. It cannot be conceived through itself. Okay, and we cannot have an adequate knowledge of external bodies because we only know about external bodies through the sensations that they produce as a result of their interactions with our bodies. So what he's going to say here is that our ideas are adequate when our mind is determined from within. That is, by the fact of regarding several things at once, to understand their points of agreement, difference, and contrast. Whenever it is determined in any wise from within, it regards things clearly and distinctly. So this last passage that I've highlighted here, basically it is the project of the rest of the ethics to explain how this could possibly be the case. What he's going to do in the ground that we're going to cover today is just to set up the problem that he's eventually going to solve in the rest of the ethics. So just to give an example, okay, of basic passions, they would be the emotions of love and hate. Love he defines as nothing else but pleasure, accompanied by the idea of an external cause. Obviously, an example here, the example he has in mind would be a person external to ourselves. And as long as we experience our emotions as being determined by factors external to ourselves, we are passive. Okay, this is what Spinoza calls a passive emotion. And what his principal concern in books 3 and 4 will be to provide a framework which will enable us to assume responsibility for our emotions. The remedy that he prescribes later in book 5 is to separate the emotions from the thought of an external cause. Okay, to accept responsibility for our emotions rather than blaming it on circumstances or on other people. And it's to this end that he introduces the conatus, which is for him, the primary cause of our emotions is in the conatus, which he defines as the endeavor to persist in being or to act in accordance with the laws of our nature. So for Spinoza, emotions, the right way to look at them will be as signals from the body that tell us how well we are succeeding in this endeavor. So joyful or pleasurable emotions are indications that our power of activity, to act in accordance with the laws of our nature, that our power of activity is increasing. Sad or painful emotions are just indicators that our power of activity is decreasing. So he is primarily concerned not with the distinction between painful and pleasurable emotions, but between passions, passive emotions, and what he calls activities of the mind. For Spinoza, the passions may be either pleasurable or painful, but according to Spinoza, all of the active emotions, where the mind is active and has adequate ideas, all of these are pleasurable. He even has a proposition in book 5 where he says that when we understand God to be the cause of pain, we to that extent feel pleasurable. So this is the whole project that Spinoza has set for himself in the Ethics, and what he's concerned with right now is just to explain this. And the key thing that we need to understand in order to follow him at this point, I think, is this idea of adequate and inadequate ideas. He has defined an adequate idea at the outset of book 2. He says it's an idea which, considered in itself,
fuck you,
without
Patrick.
relation
Fuck you.
to the... I'm sorry? What's that? Okay, he has defined an adequate idea as an idea which, considered in itself, without relation to the object, has all the properties or intrinsic marks of a true idea. This really is not very helpful, because all he's said about true ideas is, in the axioms to book 1, is that they agree with their object. So what he has in mind really doesn't begin to become clear until we get to book 3, where he explains that what he means by an adequate cause, he means a cause through which its effect can be clearly and distinctly perceived. This is a Cartesian formula. He uses it more or less interchangeably with adequate cause. So the distinction that he's making here, as I understand it, between a true idea and an adequate idea, is that an adequate idea is not merely true, but it's an idea which you are able to justify. You can say why it is true. So an example, say, of an inadequate idea in most people's cases, something like, you might remember from school that the square root of 2 is an irrational number. But chances are you're probably not able to explain why that is the case. Spinoza would say that the idea is an inadequate idea in your mind. So the question of whether an idea is adequate or not, it depends on a given mind, and it depends on the other ideas that are in the mind. And this, so it's implicit, I guess, already in Axiom 4 to Book 1, where he says the knowledge of an effect depends on and involves the knowledge of a cause. The sufficient reason. That's, if you know why something is true, then you have an adequate idea. Otherwise, it could be merely accidentally true. And he makes, this has major consequences for the rest of the ethics. His definition of activity, okay, is that to
Can
say
we quickly
that,
ask Courtney whether there is a comment to be made? Courtney?
sorry, I didn't see your hand. Courtney, did you want to say something?
Yes, I just had a question about the distinction between a true idea versus an adequate idea.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
So I understood it to mean an adequate idea is an idea that you can say is true and you can explain why it's true. Is a true idea and is a true idea something that you can say is true, but you don't understand why it's true?
I think that's the point. The the distinction is maybe not quite as clear as I have painted it, because he is going to make some statements like, when we have a true idea, we know it's true, or when we have, let me think of another case. Yeah, he says something to the effect that truth is its own standard. So what's going on here, I think, is that there is I guess, the most popular traditional way of understanding a true idea is this one. Okay, this is the correspondence theory of truth. But in philosophy, there is also a tradition of coherence theories of truth. Apparently, this goes all the way back to Aristotle. And in that case, you try to define the notion of truth in terms of how well a given idea coheres with the other ideas that you have about the world. So Spinoza wants to be in both camps, okay? He needs to be able to say that propositions about the attribute of extension are true ideas in this sense of correspondence. But he also wants a notion of truth that applies exclusively within the attribute of thought. I don't want to get too far ahead, but I think it's really enough just to keep this simple distinction in mind for the time being, and we'll tease out the refinements to it later. I just wanted to point out that this really is very important for understanding the ethics. His idea of activity and passivity depends on the adequacy or inadequacy of our ideas. This is, what he means by passions and active emotions. He says that it's impossible that man should not be part of nature, that the things that happen can be understood through his nature alone. Okay, that this is the criterion that he's using for activity of the mind. On the other hand, he seems to suggest, and this is only going to become clear much later in book 4, that if our ideas were entirely adequate, he's excluded this as impossible, but if our ideas were entirely adequate, then we would be the adequate cause of everything that happens to us, and we would therefore be free. And that is how he's eventually going to square the circle between necessitarianism and freedom. Okay, remember, the title of book 5 is, how does it go? Of human freedom or on the power of the understanding. So his whole project in the ethics, I think, is outlined here. And what he's going to be concerned with in the propositions that we'll discuss today is just showing why, as a result of our finitude, almost all of the ideas that we have about things external to ourselves, about our body, and the mind's idea of itself, all of these are normally inadequate. So I'll pass it over now to Nick. And Nick will start, unless there's any further questions that come up out of this brief survey.
Oh, thank you, Patrick. It's a very nice overview, which set the stage. All right, so let's dive into the details of a few propositions. Let me share my screen, and oh yeah, I do have the privilege. All right, can you see my screen? All right, you can. Yep. I see Robert nodding. All right, so okay, so Patrick emphasized the thought of adequate versus the inadequate ideas, but we also have some propositions related to the earlier part of the text. So I will just briefly share with you the way I'm going to organize my presentation, and do interrupt me in order to have a more interactive dialogue. So the keyword is understanding of the mind-body relationship. And we have 5 propositions which focus on the relation of sensation, imagination, reason, consciousness, as we discussed last time. And then the second part of the discussion is on the inadequate knowledge, 8 propositions. And next week, we'll finish up with adequate knowledge. So that's the structure of the presentation. So let's go on. So as a starting point, last week we discussed sensation as the starting point for our mental process, eventually reaching the emotion, etc., happiness or human flourishing. But sensation is the starting point of the discussion. And then obviously one of the question was, or at least I would have, is what exactly do sensations convey to the mind? We talk about it, but what exactly did Spinoza formulate as a transmission of sensation to the mind? The obvious answer is affection of the human body. That's his terminology. It's affections of the human body. That's a key channel of transmission. All right, so let's go on with to understand a bit better what is this human mind that knows and perceives through the affection of human body. Well, with respect to the body, through the ideas of affections, we know it or we perceive it. That's proposition 19, P19, the body. And then opposite to that is the mind. And once again, through the ideas of affections, we perceive or know mind. That's P23, another proposition. So on the access to the mind, he has a bit more details to tell us. And he has this proposition 20, which talks about the idea of mind in the same way as the idea of body, but they are in God. They are the ideas in God of our mind and of our body in very similar fashion. Then obviously our interest is knowing the access to the human mind. And through the ideas of affections, proposition 22 would say, yeah, we know the mind through the ideas of affection. That's why in P23, he combined this, the idea, the thought of ideas of affection and the understanding or the perception of our own mind. But obviously, in between the thoughts in God and the thoughts of human mind, we need a connector. We need something to tie it over. And that is the idea of mind united to mind in the same way that mind is united to body. Now, this proposition 21, which ties the thought in God and thought in human mind, it's kind of dense for me. It's loaded. So let me try to explain that proposition in more details. The P21, the important bridge. Now, P21 says this idea of the mind, the idea of the mind is united to the mind in the same way as the mind is united to body. So there are quite a few concepts going on here. So let's go first. First, the body and the idea of the body. I mean, these are commonsensical English terms, but what did Spinoza mean when he used this? Body is the object of the idea of the body. Of course, when we form idea of the body, we intend to think of the body. Therefore, body is the object of the thought of the body. Another name for the idea of the body is mind. So body is the object, then of course, of mind. And this is the formulation under the attribute of extension. The extension as one attribute we human could understand and the body, an extended body, as the object of the mind. Okay, so that is one set of formulation about body and the idea of body. Now, if we draw a parallel of that and think or replace the word body by mind, we'll get something like mind versus the idea of the mind. And in the similar fashion, mind obviously is the object of quotation quote idea of the mind. When we have an idea of the mind, obviously we're thinking of mind. All right, another simple word is consciousness. So mind is the object of the consciousness under the attribute of thought. That's another attribute different from extension. So then after I gone through this little explication of the fourth concept, and then you go back to the P31, then it makes sense. So the idea of mind is united to the mind in the same way the mind is united to body. So with that, then we can think across our thoughts on the relationship formulated under the attribute of extension over to the thoughts under the attribute of thought. And that's how he connects the thoughts in God and then the thought that formulated in our human mind.
Could I ask a question, Nick?
Yeah.
The difficulty that I have with this is that the argument seems to apply to all bodies, not just the human body. And when I mean all bodies, I mean like rocks as well as living bodies. And there, I just get stuck. I can't follow him because, well, maybe Fred has an idea.
Isn't it the case that we are talking here about the human body, starting with part 2? Matter of fact, it seems like it'd be useful if Spinoza simply stipulated it. From now on, when we talk about the body, we're referring to the human body.
Well,
For example, proposition 19 and 20.
That's certainly true. But my question, the difficulty I have is that I don't understand how his arguments fail to apply to all bodies, including insentient bodies.
It does include all bodies. All bodies.
Yeah, but then you sort of end up with a panpsychist, as far as I can see.
Well,
some people do say that Spinoza is a panpsychist, but I don't want to take that idea on board myself.
Well, I don't, to talk about pantheism is a very broad term and it's used in a lot of different ways. And I don't see that the use of the term should apply or should not apply to Spinoza, but it's quite clear that everything under the attribute of extension that can be treated as a singular object, which means that it's a configuration or a ratio of motion and stillness, or motion and what's the other terms? Motion and stability or whatever.
Yes.
All of those things can be treated as singular objects, and they are also of necessity under the attribute of thought. The secondary thought, the idea of the mind that Nick is talking about here is God's idea of the mind as a formal object under the attribute of thought. So from God's point of view, the mind, your mind and my mind, is treated as a formal object, which is represented in God's mind, and that is, of course, replicated in God's mind as a thought of a thought, an idea of an idea, and that's where you arrive at self-consciousness, because you are a single moment in God's mind, and so you share everything that God, all that God does in terms of under the attribute of thought in with respect to you as a singular object is replicated in your mind. The only thing that it doesn't extend any further than your body. Outside of your body, you don't have thoughts. Your thought is only a representation of your body. Your mind is a representation of your body. So when Nick here has in mind and the idea of mind, you have mind is the object of the idea of mind, and that therefore you have consciousness. But really it should be the idea of the mind, right? Okay, starting at the top, actually. Okay, I'll just leave this discussion that Nick has here just aside. But every singular object, every configuration or ratio of motion and stillness, that's not the term that Spinoza uses. What does he use? Motion and rest. That is treated as a singular object. That's a unity. That unity has a moment exclusively for itself under the attribute of thought. It doesn't extend under the attribute of thought beyond the configuration that establishes it as a singular object. So within that thought, in relation to that singular object, everything that transpires under the attribute of thought is happening to this object. So the rock has a thought, and the rock is self-conscious of the thought that the idea that the rock has. The rock has an idea of itself, and it's self-conscious of that.
Well,
and then it goes to
that is panpsychism, not pantheism, panpsychism. That is, and many people do say that this is the only way to understand Spinoza. It's not something that I feel comfortable with, but well, Nick, I think we better let you continue because
I would just
No, that's okay. Fred,
all I'd suggest is that that may well be true, but that's a separate question, it seems, from what Spinoza is addressing in part 2, where it's pretty clear in the postulates in the proposition 14, again in 16, 17, and on, that he's referring to human body. It's an interesting question to what extent it can be extrapolated to insensate bodies. That's an interesting question. However, it doesn't seem to be what Spinoza himself is addressing in the current propositions, part 2 that we're considering. Is that correct?
No, you're right, Fred. You're right, Fred. He's concerned now from this point on in the ethics with human being, not the being of rocks or plants or animals, right? So that's absolutely true. But there is no question. I mean, whether or not the term pantheism applies to Spinoza, I don't think that it's, I don't object to applying the term pantheism to Spinoza, because in some sense, the entire universe is animated. And so for that reason, but again, pantheism is such a broad term that it doesn't mean, for example, like in Indian cultures, where every plant has its own individual, unique God, its own individual God with its own life. It's an autonomous life of its own in a plant with a God, attached to it. That's different from Spinoza, clearly, because Spinoza is not interested. A rock has thought of necessity. We know that. It's a singular substance, right? Then the two attributes apply. So a rock has thought, but so little thought, it's ridiculous compared to like a human being that is subject to effects of an infinite variety of different effects. And every effect that is felt by our body is represented under the attribute of thought with an idea. And that gives us the illusion of, free will and a self-identity and, everything else that we imagine is true of human lives that we would not attribute to anything like most people would not even attribute it to something like a dog. But as far as I'm concerned, a dog has almost all the life that a human being does, quite clearly. But, like a plant, people would say a plant hardly has any life. A plant has an enormous amount of life, So,
Robert, I think we better let Nick continue because he has quite a lot of ground
okay.
to cover.
All
And
Yeah, but this discussion is good. So I have two thoughts on this. Number one, I agree with Fred that there's text evidence that Spinoza is talking about human body here. That's why I capitalize the body to refer to human body, and the text is very clear for those few propositions that he's thinking about human body. But so therefore the direction of the perception is from human body towards others, etc. Now the discussion about rock, I think leaving aside the rock can think or not, if when we human mind perceive a rock, what do we perceive? Well, Aristotle would say, well, we perceive the form of the rock. And that's the idea that Spinoza also has, which is that when we perceive the form of the stuff. And his key point here in this text, in these few propositions, actually is on the idea of idea. That's really his focus. And this is a very readable text. Someone knows something. Let's say somebody perceives a rock. He thereby knows that he knows it. This perception. I know a rock, then I know a rock. And at the same time, he knows that he knows that he knows, and so on to infinity. So this is really his idea about idea of idea, or the idea of mind. Yeah, when we think of through the affections on our own body. But then I realize I am receiving those sensual signals affecting from the effect on my body, and so on and so forth. So this is really his thought process, and with that thought, he can formulate the relationship of the ideas on mind and the idea of idea, etc., etc. So I thought that was interesting, and these are the takeaways for me on those 5 propositions, which kind of tie together the concept of sensation / imagination,
Slash what? Sensation / what? Nick?
Nick's still there?
Imagination, he said.
Oh, did you say imagination? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Have you been cut off, Nick?
It looks like maybe he has to rejoin, or we'll just see what happens.
Just while we're waiting for him to come back, then
Oh, Alex has something. Go ahead.
Okay, Alex, why don't you jump in?
Thanks. Just a quick point. Well, a question that this is raising for me, and this will probably bring up a lot of other issues. I don't want to go off on a big tangent, but just on that proposition 21, for me, this is raising, I mean, obviously that whole question of the relation of mind to body, and also really maybe what what it means for those two to be attributes, and for them to be attributes of the same thing, it does seem to that connection will turn out to be some kind of identity, right? Or some kind of, I guess it's often called a parallelism between the mind and the body. And interestingly, then that seems to revert to the mind relating to itself by way of the same kind of relation. And I guess just a kind of something I'm finding curious, that, you know, given that there is this underlying identity of mind and body, that there should still be that difference of attributes. You know, that's somehow puzzling to me. And I wanted to put that on the table, that whether we think of attributes as maybe certain points of view or ways of relating to that one identity, it's quite puzzling that there should be this multiplicity of ways.
Well, I think that this is something very easy to answer, and at least in my understanding, seems to me to be, it's quite simple. It's extraordinarily simple. You know, I'm always very concerned about people having difficulty with this idea of multiple attributes in a single substance, because it seems to me to be extraordinarily simple what he's saying. He's just saying there's a single substance, right, Alex? And let's for a moment just pretend that there's a single attribute, and that's thought, right? Well, the substance of that case, if we're talking about thought, it's in no place. It doesn't have a place anywhere in the world, right? It's not situated anywhere in the world. So it doesn't have extension. So you have a single substance, and it has a single attribute of thought. We're just presupposing this for a moment, that as a single attribute of thought, that single substance doesn't take up space. And you know, all the things that the qualities that extended substance has, none of those qualities are associated with thought. So let's say add another to the same single substance. We'll add another attribute, extension. All of a sudden we have extension. And of course, this substance that we're talking about is infinite, right? So that means everywhere in the world, there is a substance that has thinking going on. There is always some level of thought. There's never a moment anywhere in the world where there isn't some thought. And the extension means that it's everywhere. It extends everywhere. So now, if you think about that, you think, well, how can something that, like thinking, that doesn't take up space be identical, absolutely identical with substance that is only space? That's all it is extended space, extension, right, in space. Well, the reason that they can be identical is because thought and extension have such radically different natures that they don't conflict with one another. They can be one substance with two essential attributes, in the sense that it constitutes the essence of the substance, with thought and extension, because they don't conflict with one another. They can both be essential to the single substance without being at odds with one another. But at the same time, that means if you have a rock, that's a very crude ratio of motion and rest, right? It's not a complex singular object like a human body, but you have a rock, and that is, to a certain extent, a ratio, a singular object constituted by a ratio of motion and rest. And that means that there's a little bit of thought that has that ratio too, in the realm of thought, which means that it doesn't have, you know, if you're talking about extension, if you have motion and rest, that means that you have to have something like material matter, or something like, how can you have motion and rest unless you have something that provides the mass for the motion and rest, right? But in thought, you don't have that at all. In thought, it's just pure thought. It doesn't constitute space. So you have to think about the mind of a rock, very crude example of a singular object. There is nevertheless a little bit of motion and rest in the mind, which doesn't take up space. So he's talking about motion and rest in a spaceless domain of the world, right?
And so I guess that fits with that last line there, P21S, of how the mind relates to itself. It seems to be, it's the same kind of relation, even though mind relating to mind, just like you're saying, I guess is without space directly. Like
There's no
Mhm.
way that anything
Okay.
under attribute of extension can have a direct causal effect on your mind, because extension is in space and the mind is not in space. It can't, there's no way anything in the body causes something to happen in the mind. That's what we're grappling
Fred,
with. Because
I think Fred maybe wants to get in here. Fred?
Part of the confusion, at least for me, is in the wording in the scholium of 21, where it says the mind and the body. There we show that the idea of the body and the body itself, that is, mind and body, are one and the same individual thing, conceived now under the attribute of thought, now under the attribute of extension. I would find it more clear if the statement was the mind and the body are two different aspects of one and the same individual thing. The person, presumably, conceived now under the attribute of thought and now under the attribute of extension. So it's not an identity of thought and extension. It's rather that there's an identity of the underlying thing that can be perceived under the two aspects, mind and body, or in the same way under the attributes of thought and extension. At least
that
that's
could be a better way of thinking of it. That could be a better way of thinking of the substance, and then saying, okay, we can think about the substance as thought, or we can think about the substance as extension. That may be a better way of thinking about it. The only reason that I don't prefer myself to look at it that way is because substance itself is constituted by these essential attributes. An essential attribute is what that means is that substance takes being as extension and thought. It takes being in the world as extension and thought. If you remove those attributes, substance could not exist. Substance cannot exist without an essential attribute, at least one. In the case of Descartes, there's only just one.
I think we better give Nick a chance to. He
Yeah,
aims
it's
to get
okay.
to,
It's
to
okay.
Proposition 31.
Yeah,
So,
that's okay. That's it's a good discussion. Yeah, it always challenges to think monism this way. Okay, so all right. So with that, I'll move on to the second part of the discussion, which is in reference to the quality of the knowledge, inadequate knowledge, to be specific. I'm going to start with P29. Patrick started with P29 Scholia. I'm going to start with the corollary of 29. And very similarly, it summarizes his thought. Human mind does not have an adequate, but only a confused and mutilated knowledge of itself, of its own body, and of external bodies, the rocks. So this is his thought. This is his statement. This is a conclusion. So let's just say, what does he mean? All right. So the mind, or the ideas or affections of human body. I mean, the English translation or his Latin text is structured in a kind of convoluted way. But he's really saying, our mind doesn't have adequate knowledge. It does not involve adequate knowledge of what? With respect to external bodies, we don't have adequate knowledge. That's P25, Proposition 25. Well, with respect to the human body, the big B body, we don't either. That's P27, another proposition. We just don't have adequate knowledge. With respect to mind, yeah, we don't have adequate knowledge. P28. Well, 29 is a subtle variation of P28. And this is with respect to mind, the consciousness has no adequate knowledge. The idea of the mind does not involve adequate knowledge of mind. This is a bit subtle, but my way of crudely presenting it is to think of conscious mind versus just plain thought. Okay, so this is what he says as conclusion. Obviously, there are lots of questions in understanding what he's thinking. My question, first one is, why inadequate? Well, he defined what is inadequate knowledge, but why can't we have adequate question? Why inadequate? What's the reason? To answer that, let's explicate P29 scolia, which Patrick actually went over at the beginning, but let me try my version of it in understanding that important passage. And here are some important concepts in the scholium. The mind perceives things from the common order of nature. Things here are rocks, right? Including human body and rocks and everything else. So what is meant by common order of nature? These are very simple English terms, but what do they mean when Spinoza put them together? What is the philosophy behind it? Well, this is what he meant. Common order of nature determined externally. Again, that is meant by saying it's determined externally by a chance coincidence. Fortuito occurso, Latin. It's good to learn some Latin terms. So if you have a common order of nature and your perception of things are determined externally by that common order of nature, that means it's determined by a chance coincidence. You just happen to come across that or perceive that or come to understand it or acquire knowledge of it. It's pure chance. Now, opposite to this concept is determined internally. And by that, he meant by a universal concatenation of causes. For those who were here last week, we talked about linking up, concatenate, or sequencing causes. Now, he meant by determine internally that mental process. If we could link up causes, then our knowledge, our perception of things from the common order of nature will not be a chance coincidence. It will not be externally determined. It will be causally determined. That's what he meant by using those simple words, at least as translated. Fred.
Yeah, the common order of nature sounds a lot like, and probably is closely related to Aristotle's sensus communis, an extra sense, which was given by Aristotle, which is sort of what allows us to unify things into a whole. And it seems related here in that when we have a chance coincidence, my interpretation, which may be wrong at this, that with our very limited minds, we are trying to conceive of an object as a whole from this or that perception that we have of it. We're trying the best we can to determine something from our what our chance encounter with that thing, whereas God, presumably, or the universe, determined internally by universal concatenation of causes. I take that as the only way that you can completely know something, i.e., that you can have an adequate knowledge. It would be if you comprehended the transitive closure of all causes of that object. We can't do that, obviously, but presumably God or some perfect intellect could. I don't know, that's just my interpretation, but I know it's common order of nature. It sounds a lot like sensus communis.
Could I just jump in there before Alex and just point out that he, as far as I remember, often contrasts that phrase with the intellectual order. So he talks about arranging our ideas according to the common order of nature on the one hand, and arranging them according to the intellectual order on the other. So I think what he's getting at is just this idea of accidental association of ideas that we talked about last time, but it's just my guess. Alex, I jumped in ahead of you there.
Oh, no worries. Thanks, Patrick. What's coming to my mind with these terms, external and internal, and this is really helpful breakdown here on the slide. But I do wonder, so when we speak of internal, and I suppose external as well, it does seem like there's going to be a degree of relativity to that, at least to the extent that we're speaking of any given mind, right? So suppose I'm meditating on my ideas or perceiving things. If internal means internal to my mind, like inner to my mind, then since I am a mode, then any kind of internality to me, I'm not a substance, right? So I don't possess a kind of absolute internal nature or essence. I am in God. I'm not in myself ultimately. And so I wonder if if we're going to speak in a kind of philosophical rigor about the internal and the external, it seems like the reference ultimately is to God and to God's intellect or God's mind. And I wonder if then perceiving things adequately for us as finite modes would involve somehow tapping into or relating to or penetrating to God's mind in some way. Which, if we are modes in God, I suppose that won't be such a strange thing at that point.
Yeah, it's good thought. So here, the connotation of external, internal really is subtly different in his usage from our ordinary usage after Kant. So internally, he really meant that it's rational, it somehow complies with the laws of nature. So in that sense, we might say actually it's externally laws of the phenomenal world. But this is what he meant. So with that caveat, I like to comment on Fred's question. Fred, actually, the Latin term for the common, yeah, it's the same in both places, the common order of nature or common sense. So it's a communus. However, the sensus communus we discussed last week is in reference to our internal faculty, our internal mental faculty, which is to form a perception out of the 5 external senses. So that's the concept. But here, the common order of nature, actually the Latin is communis natura ordo. so clearly textually it's different, and it refers more to the outside world rather than our internal mental process. But the common ground is this communius. So with that, but the second part of comment is interesting, which is the next point I'm going to make, is that he introduced, obviously, as many other mainstream philosophers, the parts and whole argument. Yeah. So in order to understand the entire order of nature, the common order of nature, either we understand it internally, externally, but rationally, but holistically, that's a precondition for our understanding of individual parts. Okay, now, oops, what happened? With that, he has a proposition 24. Mind does not involve adequate knowledge of the parts composing the human body, because as was alluded to by either Fred or actually Alex as well, the ability to comprehend the totality of the common order of nature, that can only lie within God. You know, we human may be able to partake that, as Patrick suggested at the beginning. Eventually we have to close the circle somehow to achieve a certain degree of the feeling of freedom and be able to somehow to understand the totality of what's going on. But that is absolutely within God, and we may absolutely not have the access to it. And without the access to the understanding of totality of the nature, we are not able to understand precisely the parts composing the totality. And here, the totality of a human body. So that's his logic. Huh? If you don't understand the whole, you don't understand the part. Well, that's one of the propositions. And the other proposition, I extend this thinking to external bodies here now. Mind doesn't perceive any external body as actually existing. This sounds very much like Berkeley or the Kantian notion of noumena. The body the mind does not perceive the existence of external body. Because of this logic, because of this inability of human mind to perceive, to grasp, to understand totality of the natural order of nature. All right, so that's at the root of the cause for inadequate knowledge. Why do we have inadequate knowledge? Well, because we are, as humans, are not able to comprehend the totality of the nature, and therefore we're not able to have precise or adequate knowledge of all the other stuff. Well, I don't know whether you agree with that or not, or disagree, but that's his logic. Yeah, that's his presupposition. All right. Courtney.
For me, this raises questions about culpability. If people are unable to have adequate knowledge, how can they be held culpable for their ignorance? Or how can there be culpability for an inadequate set of knowledge leading to disaster? But I guess that's just, I don't know.
Good question. Yeah, I know Patrick want to comment.
Well, of course, it's a huge project that Spinoza is undertaking, where he will eventually try to answer that sort of question. But here, I think he's just setting the scene. He's explaining the starting point. That, you know, for his project, the fact that our finite nature makes it so that our knowledge of the world is necessarily confused or mutilated or fragmented. And this is just setting the scene. Starting like next week, he will begin to explain how we can start to have adequate knowledge despite the sort of bleak picture that he's painting here. In fact, even in the second, I mean, that's his promise in the second part of the Scholium, that he will say how when the mind is, instead of being determined externally, fortuitously by, well, random associations of events, how it is nonetheless going to be possible for the mind to arrive at an adequate knowledge of its situation, and in particular, how to arrive at adequate knowledge of our emotions. But this is a huge undertaking. We're still just at the foothills of this, at the foothills of this mountain range.
I think that what's key is that adequate knowledge depends on reason. And, to be determined externally by chance coincidence, that just means ordinary empirical experience. And for Spinoza, that doesn't add up to anything like adequate knowledge ever. It's impossible. It does show that, I think, for Spinoza, that our ordinary common experience, common reality, is a grotesque distortion of what is actually the case. The best analogy I can think of is that if you think of the laws of physics that are practiced by, physicists, I don't want to talk about quantum physics. I'm just talking about, orthodox physics, the way it's understood by precise laws, necessary laws, generally understood by everyone, whereas everything else is just a personal experience of what has transpired in the world, in a sense. You can make some sort of generalizations. I mean, people can even have common notions about common ordinary experiences that will lead you sort of in the direction of something like what I guess would be described as being good common sense, but certainly not adequate knowledge, not in Spinoza's view. So
but he does have a proposition, which we'll come to shortly, where he says explicitly that the mind's inadequate ideas are determined by the same necessity as the adequate ideas. What is in his mind, what he is describing here, is a perfectly lawful process. It all fits into the same overall framework.
Yeah.
But all of this needs to be explicated later.
But that is interesting, Our illusions and ignorance are determined. They're subject to the principle of sufficient reason. There's a good reason
yeah,
why.
it's a necessary. It seems to me to be just a necessary consequence of our finitude. It's not a
Yeah.
failing. It just has to be that way, given our finite capacities.
Yeah. And by the way, when you talk about the common order of nature, you're talking about, let's for a moment, just if you're thinking of terms of efficient causation under the attribute of extension, God has the infinity in his mind, but that would not provide God with adequate understanding. There are other laws, essential laws, and the powers that obtain amongst the essences that determine whether God achieves adequate knowledge of any phenomena, and that would be replicated in our own minds if we understand and apply the laws of the essences and the degrees of power emanating from the essences. That also is required for adequate knowledge. It's just not a matter of God having the infinite series of efficient cause and effects, chain of cause and effects reaching to eternity, to infinity rather. That's not adequate either.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah.
I was just add, Nick, that when I read that contrast between determined externally and determined internally, what that reminded me of was Spinoza's idea of freedom. That's going way back to the axioms in Book One, where he says that he says that a free something is free if it has two properties. One is if it's the cause of itself, that of course is only God, but also if its actions are determined from within, okay, rather than being determined by circumstances external to itself. And that's going to be at the root of his idea of the activity versus the passivity of the mind, whether the mind is drawing on its own internal resources in thinking, or whether it's just being pushed around by fortuitous circumstances.
I see. Well, this is the interesting, Courtney.
You said those two conditions where it had to be the cause of itself, and then
But this is just when he introduces at the very beginning of Book One, he introduces he says what he means by freedom. He says, firstly, a thing exists solely by the necessity of its own nature. We know that could only be God. And secondly, a thing whose action is determined by itself alone, rather than being determined by circumstances or factors external to itself.
So the question is, do thinking sentient beings, when they do things, do they do these things from within, like with internal motivations, or is it
I glossed over it very briefly at the beginning, but that is the distinction that Spinoza makes between active and passive, between passions, passive emotions, and active rational affects. That it's precisely that, whether it's internally driven or driven by circumstances external to ourselves.
Well, just in this regard, I want to try to raise, I suppose, a worry, maybe something to keep. I'm going to be keeping in mind going forward. But on this question of activity, I wonder, how can Spinoza posit that, let's say, that a human mind, a human being, can have activity in any sense, or in anything other than a derivative sense, without also positing the human being as a substance?
It's a good question. Very good question.
Right? Because it seems that if we are to be active, activity is somehow coming closer to substancehood. And I suppose the only two.
Indeed, I believe that what he is saying is that we can become more substance-like, okay? More internally determined than externally determined.
I wonder if there is a
through
notion.
the power of the understanding, but obviously this is limited. Because we are not substances precisely.
But it is very interesting. You know, there's a number of different very difficult things to reconcile in Spinoza, and one of them is this notion that activity, in a sense, just in simple terms, activity is the closest we can come to something like virtue, you know, or happiness through the exercise, as opposed to being passive. But at the same time, it seems like everything is absolutely determined. Thoughts are determined. Like, I don't know how he proposes this little moment of freedom that where we can actually be morally responsible for engaging in an activity as opposed to allowing ourselves to become subjects, passive subjects, you know. So that is a very good question. The other question I've never been able to figure out for the life of me is how Spinoza can depend so much on conatus, which is, or conatus, or however you pronounce it, you know, because conatus seems to me to be a little bit at odds with absolute necessity too, you know? It's like something wants to persist in its own being.
There is no conflict between the idea that we are fully determined on the one hand, and the idea that we have internal resources which enable us to act on our environment on the other. There's no conflict there.
I suppose we would need to distinguish between the absolute sense of internal that pertains to God and a more relative sense of internal that pertains to, you know, a complex mode such as ourselves, certainly much more complex than a rock. And if, you know, and perhaps that complexity gives rise to a kind of internality, but I can only see it in a relative sense. And it seems to me, unless
we are in fact so complex that we can't actually have an adequate idea of ourselves. But we still have the resources that enable us to act on our environment in order to preserve our being.
But you know, these questions that you're posing now, Alex, they are resolved before you reach. By the time you reach the end of book 5, it's resolved. These problems. I pose them now because it's been so long, and my reading of the latter part of the ethics is so bad that I couldn't answer that question, quite frankly. You know, how you could reconcile.
I mean, in case it's that obvious, you know, Spinoza really is radical in his ideas and in his approaches to these questions. Really quite different from the you know, the tradition in the Western canon. So it's not surprising that it takes a lot of effort to assimilate his ideas. They really are, in many cases, quite strange, quite counterintuitive.
Yeah.
But the odd thing is that it all fits together eventually.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm just telling everybody, hang in there. By the time you finish the 5th part, then you'll know the answer to the questions that we've been dealing with here.
This really is the most challenging part. The tone is, you know, it does change. It becomes a lot more user-friendly from book 3 onwards.
Right. Courtney, I thought you had your hand up. Did you want to comment or not?
No, I'm good. Thank you.
Okay, fine. So I just want to echo your original question, because this is also one of my motivation to read ethics. Is, you know, what kind of a reward punishment system Spinoza would set up, given his main thoughts on inadequate knowledge or the determinism, etc., etc. Okay, so let's read on. So to finish up this page, just want to share, a corollary. It's same idea, but he apply it to this case of imagination. Yeah. So the main text of P26 talks about perception, but when the object of our perception is absent, that is the imagination. He says, yeah, again, even if we imagine, we wouldn't have adequate knowledge of it. All right. So then there's another concept which is interesting. I thought duration, and that is in P30. And the duration of our body depends on the common order of nature. Okay, so that's his supposition. And so this is one of the commentator, Wolfson, when things are viewed as a part of the common order of nature, they are said to have duration or an indefinite continuation of existence. Indefinite. So we don't have a perfect knowledge of it. So as you recall, the four propositions says we don't have adequate knowledge. Now, by introducing another concept of duration, he can formulate yet another two propositions, which are just, the variation on the same. Duration of external body, no, we don't have adequate knowledge of that. Duration of body, human body, no, we don't have definite understanding or adequate knowledge. So we end up with all the inadequate knowledge of all those things. All right. So as you can see, the last proposition is 31. There's a very interesting corollary, which says all particular things are contingent. So there's another concept introduced, or not introduced, re-emphasized, contingent. So what is meant by contingent? And this is one of his key ideas. What happened? All right. It does not mean, not meant existentially, that things are without a cause. It's not meant by that, by him. What's going on? It's meant epistemologically that we, human, have no adequate knowledge of things in their true causal relations, because we don't know. So they become contingent in appearance to us. That's what he meant when he says all particular things are contingent, because we don't know. This is one of his key ideas. Even before I read ethics, I came across this in secondary literature, that he's glossed over lack of freedom is that we don't know, and we thought things are contingent, things could be arranged, could be chosen, and we thought so. So this is the textual evidence of his thought, at least one of them, which is kind of interesting. And obviously, if you recall part 1, very important proposition, the Scholium 1, a thing is called contingent only because of a defect of our knowledge. And here we come to really understand what he meant by that. Inadequate knowledge. All right, that's another important thought of his. And I feel like when reading through this, putting this together, I felt, well, okay, I found the source of that statement somehow. So part 2 is not boring to me, Patrick, actually. So it's quite user-friendly for me.
Great. Well, your background, I guess, is in philosophy. So you know your way around this sort of
Not
different
really,
field.
Patrick.
No?
I was I started a year ago to join the
Really?
meetup. Yeah,
Really? Yeah.
philosophy. All right. So that's all I want to share with you on those 8 propositions on inadequacy of knowledge, plus the earlier 5 propositions on relationship of sensations and thought, etc. So before I open up, I have one of my questions to you guys. I'd appreciate any thought on it. So a question for me from me. Locke. Locke was a contemporary of Spinoza. They were born like 1 year apart. But Locke get to live longer, but they were of the same age. So Locke had this also the formulation of mode ideas that are adequate. These are very fuzzy citations, but I just wonder if anybody happened to know if they could share light on the relationship of Locke's thought in this particular area with what we have covered, Spinoza's thought there. I'll yield back.
Not me, unfortunately. I wonder if Fred could jump in.
I'm not familiar with that quote from Locke.
Yeah, I don't know what he means by mode ideas.
Yeah, neither do I. But his formulation that eventually he formulated simple ideas, right? So and mode idea somehow is on the way to his formulation of simple ideas, and he was talking about all those being adequate. I guess I raised this question just because superficially they share the same English terms as Spinoza's text. But anyway, I'll mark that up for future reference. Yeah.
I know that,
But
I know
yeah.
that Locke's his concept, well, I think that he's just using the same terms for different things. Modes are for Locke are kinds of ideas. Don't quote me on this, but I think it's roughly finite ideas or something like that. Maybe somebody could look it up. It's a restriction of ideas.
I see. That's helpful.
I don't
just
think any of us have a good enough grasp on Locke and his ideas now to really draw a good comparison between the two. If I may, there's one little section that I thought was very interesting tonight. What we were reading tonight. I'm going to share my screen if you don't mind. Nick, is that cool?
Yeah, go ahead, Robert.
Okay, so there. I'll just quickly share this proposition. We've already talked about it. It's proposition 31, and what I found interesting was that it seemed to me to be a completely circular argument that he was presenting here. I think maybe that's a little bit too big for everybody. Is it too big, the screen sharing there? I'll just reduce it a bit. Okay. So we only have entirely adequate ideas of the duration of the singular things which are outside of us, right? They're entirely inadequate because we don't know what's going to cause the demise, and we don't know where the singular object originated. So his demonstration I thought was quite interesting because he says, for each singular thing, like the human body, must be determined by another singular thing to exist and produce effects in a certain and determinate way, and this again by another, and so to infinity, which is, of course, the series of efficient causes and effects. But since in P30, we have demonstrated from this common property of singular things that we have only a very inadequate knowledge of the duration of our body. We shall have to draw the same conclusion concerning the duration of singular things outside us, vis-a-vis that we can only have a very inadequate knowledge of their duration. Does everybody see how circular this argument is here?
Well, is it really circular, or is he not just saying that the same argument applies as in the demonstration of Proposition 30?
Yeah.
I mean, it's clumsily written, but it seems that the most charitable reading would be that he's just saying, by the same reasoning, the same conclusion follows.
Yeah. Well, it is kind of interesting that he would say, but we have demonstrated from the common property of singular things, we know that the human body is a singular thing, and so therefore we have to draw the same conclusion. And then he goes on to say that from this it follows that all particular things are contingent and corruptible, for we can have no adequate knowledge of their duration, and this is what we must understand by contingency of things and the possibility of their corruption, which is the point that Nick just made. That's really, when you talk about contingency, you're talking about inadequate knowledge, and it doesn't go any further than that, because everything happens of necessity, right? So does anybody else have any remarks to make about what we're looking at here tonight? One thing, if I were to offer just a kind of a description of the way that I understand what the theme is running through the question of adequate and inadequate ideas, just on the level of singular objects, the reason that we have, like, God can have an adequate idea of any one of our bodies, complete adequate understanding of our bodies, because God, his mind, he has an idea that represents every single moment of extension that constitute all the causes that lead up to our body, insofar as our body can be treated as an effect, right? In other words, God has the principle of sufficient reason down pat, because he knows, he has all the ideas of all the causes that lead up to our body. And then he also knows all the effects that follow from the demise of our bodies, the things that go on after we're dead and or disintegrated or whatever. So that's why we only have an inadequate idea, because our mind doesn't extend beyond the dimensions of our body. It is merely the idea of our body, not bodies prior and not bodies subsequent. So that's exactly how it happens. That's why God can know, because he's in a place that he's in eternity, right, or whatever. Go ahead, Nick.
Yeah, I forgot to mention, actually, Spinoza did not just have the thought of inadequate knowledge. He also has a lot of knowledge that he thought was adequate. But that's a topic for next meeting. But I just want to put that thought on the table. That it's not that his formulation of human knowledge is something like Kantian in access to noumena that we just don't know. But he does have adequate knowledge, this concept, but it's later, so it's kind of interesting, to compare that, but without forgetting.
You bring up Kant a lot. That for Kant, Spinoza is a beautiful example of what goes wrong if you don't submit rational thought to the possibilities of experience. This is a beautiful example for Kant. Kant would say Spinoza just went wild because he employed rationality without subjecting it to the possible conditions of experience in space and time, right? In space and time, we have possible experiences, and nothing, rationality cannot extend beyond the possibilities that are provided to us through space and time and the intuitive forms of ordinary objects, common reality, right? For
Robert,
Spinoza, for Spinoza, he would just simply say, you got it completely wrong. As soon as you move into anything that can be described as sensation, you're lost. Rationality is the only certain knowledge we could ever achieve. But of course, we can
I'm
achieve.
curious, Rob, where do you draw the line there? Seems to me like Kant maybe will travel with Spinoza down to that second kind of knowledge. He'll say, yeah, we have knowledge of rationality, of kind of causes linking up one with the other. But it seems that he would definitely break away when it comes to the speculative knowledge, or this third kind of knowledge, the knowledge of God. Seems like that's where we really draw the line, like Kant would really draw the line. Is that how you were thinking of this?
Well, yeah, that's what Kant would call speculation, pure speculation. But for Kant, you can't know the nature of God, period. It's beyond our possible experience, right? And we only have a sensibility that is limited to what we could sort of possibly experience, not what we've actually experienced. And it's not like an empiricist. He's saying what we could possibly experience. We can't extend rational forms of thought beyond that. But of course, Spinoza goes all the way. He goes so far that he doesn't even bring the effects of the body, sensation or anything like that into the conversation. It's just irrelevant to him. Really, in my view, I just think that for Spinoza, everything that we ordinarily understand to be common human experience is just a kind of a mess of an illusion, just a hopelessly confused and of no real value whatsoever, that only rationality is of any really good use. I wonder if what I'm saying is actually, that's how I think, that's my view. Okay, that's my opinion of the matter.
Well, it will hopefully become clearer in fairly short order. If we look at the future development in book 2, so what we've done now, I guess, is covered the principal source of what he calls knowledge of the first kind, or confused impressions of external bodies driven by our sense perceptions. But starting at the next proposition 32, and going all the way up to 40, he is going to be talking about knowledge of the second kind, what he calls reason. And proposition 40 is a sort of critical juncture, because it's there where he introduces knowledge of the third kind. And the first scholium in proposition 40 is concerned with circumscribing rationality. In fact, in my reading, it's really quite limited what Spinoza allows in under the rubric of knowledge of the second kind. And in book 5, he's going to make very, very strong claims about knowledge of the third kind. So it seems to me that it's sort of critical that we drill down on knowledge of the third kind and its relation to the other two types of knowledge, despite the fact that Spinoza has actually given us very little text to work with, so that it seems to me that most commentators just skip over it because there doesn't seem to be an awful lot to say about it. But then when we come to book 5, we find that it is actually the principal subject of book 5. And if you have nothing to say about knowledge of the third kind in book 2, then you have nothing to say much about what's going on in book 5. So that's I think the major issue that we have to try to understand where he's going to draw the lines around knowledge of the second kind and the claims that he's going to make for knowledge of the third kind.
I have to say, I really appreciate the format of these. That's really helpful to have that context, Patrick. Otherwise, you just get lost in these somewhat obscure, really medieval.
Yeah, I was really concerned approaching book 2 that if we didn't have some sort of roadmap that we would get lost. But the plan right now is that Nick will continue up to Proposition 40, the first scholium in Proposition 40. Nick, looking at Wilson's commentary, it seems to me to be very comprehensive. I don't think I would have anything that I would want to add beyond what he has explicated about common notions and so on. I think I would suggest that you do that presentation as you best see fit. It's very interesting, I think, the first scholium to Proposition 40, where Spinoza goes out of his way to reject universals, all of them. And I think his purpose there really is to draw a very tight boundary around what he means by knowledge of the second kind. Nick, perhaps you're familiar with this issue. You know, the great medieval controversy between the nominalists and the realists.
Yeah.
Yeah. Spinoza aligns himself very definitely with the nominalists. As far as I remember, Robert, you found this rather surprising when a couple of meetings ago you mentioned this.
Yeah, I mean, you know, we disagree on a lot of things. First of all, I believe that there are essences that provide a formal cause, and formal causes play a fundamental role in the world of Spinoza, and that also, if you're talking about an essence and a formal cause, you're already talking about a universal in a sense. An essence that serves as a formal cause.
So my understanding, our agreement is that you want to take a meeting to air those concerns.
What I'm going to suggest is the essay that you recommended to me. That essay is beautifully written, and she covers all the ground that's necessary for anyone to follow to understand the problems, right? And that's what I would recommend, that at first everyone look at that essay by that woman. I forgot her name right now, but she wrote a beautiful essay. It's very easy to read, and it's lucid in its expression of the problems of universals. And she comes to a different conclusion than I would. She, in the end, decides that universals are something that Spinoza has just denied altogether. But I don't believe it's possible for Spinoza to deny universals altogether. And I think that there are eternal essences that serve almost like Platonic forms, not in strictly Platonic forms, but something like Platonic forms that are required in order to provide for the world that Spinoza describes. And so I'll be talking about essences, eternal essences, universal essences, and those are universals, and formal causes in the discussion that I'm going to have. So I'm going to recommend before that meeting comes up, which is not in 2 weeks or something like that, that everyone take a look at that woman's essay.
Okay,
because
so that's in 2 weeks' time. So can I suggest then you write up the meetup page with that reference and tell us what
for the 18th,
we should, what we should prepare. Then after that, we will come to knowledge of the third kind, And I'd like to have a go at that. I want to have a look at what other indications Spinoza has given in his other writings
Okay,
about how to understand that.
sure. Fred, you had your hand up. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, I took it down.
Oh, you did?
I
Okay.
didn't have anything to say. Well, I would like to say that I appreciate Nick's presentation. I thought that was very helpful and informative. Other than that, I don't have anything to say, and I got to go. But thanks a lot for all your information.
Okay, good night.
Okay. Have a good night, Fred.
But
So,
Just a quick follow-up, Rob, and I have to actually get going myself, but interesting question. I mean, if supposing that the Spinoza does indeed reject universals, then an interesting question is, how does knowledge proceed for him if it's not on that model, classical model of, I think, both Plato and Aristotle, really, that we know by way of a universal, right? By way of a general kind or species or genus or what have you. And I'm very intrigued by the connection between essence and power. And I'm very
yeah,
intrigued.
that's a very important point as well. Yeah, essence and
Could there
power.
be, yeah, and could there be a way in which knowledge is actually a form of power, that maybe the model to think of knowledge is something distinct from that universal and particular model that we get from the tradition? And I mean, I don't know. I'm just waiting for the text in those discussions, because that for me is one of the really motivating questions going forward.
Yeah, I think when you talk about the power to be, God's power to be, that's really his essence. That when he says the existence as an attribute, an essential attribute, that just means the power to be, right? So in a sense, I do think that the power to be is the place where all of the world comes into being for Spinoza. It originates in God. Like, in other words, that power to be is exclusive with God's, but cause and effects are felt throughout all of the sequences that you can find in the world, right? The order of being and the infinite sort of efficient causes and effects on the lateral or on the horizontal scheme of things. That it all originates with God, but every for Spinoza, every single entity is an effect and is also a cause. Nothing is neutral in his world, So power is certainly one of the most important concepts in Spinoza. I think that when he uses the word conatos, sometimes he's just talking about necessitated causal power, the causal power that a singular object has because it's an effect of something else, So, Courtney?
So, on the idea of knowledge being power. So with Spinoza and his idea on with his ideas on knowledge, on his ideas on knowledge, and how we didn't have we don't have like complete knowledge. So in the scenario where knowledge is power, can we safely say that Spinoza believes that man's power will be limited?
Well, I'm not sure if this quite answers Alex's question, but for Spinoza, it is definitely the case that the only power that he's interested in is the power of the understanding, the human mind's power to understand. That's what he's going to offer as the solution to our finite situation.
So he's basically saying leave infinity up to God or the substance.
Well,
Not in
I
principle.
I think Spinoza's view is that we participate in God's understanding, and we can do that to a greater or lesser degree.
Yeah. So not in principle, we are not condemned because we're creatures or something like that. You know, in principle, we should be able to eventually, it'd be an incredible miracle if it ever happened, but in principle, we should be able to rise to something like the divine perspective on the nature of the world, you know, and but of course you would never ever get there, but there's no reason why we couldn't, because um, our
Well,
minds are just
what he calls the eternal part of the mind is the part of the mind that consists of adequate ideas, and adequate ideas are God's ideas. that we
So,
can,
well,
to a greater or lesser degree, acquire the power of adequately understanding our situation.
so these adequate ideas are explanations of causes, and these causes are myriad in nature, infinite really, and to have adequate knowledge of a thing is to understand all of its causes. This is as I understand it from this conversation. So
basically that's what it
I
means.
think,
Yeah.
well, you see, this is obviously impossible.
yeah,
Okay,
but that's
we,
what I'm getting at. That's what I'm getting at. So like
and Spinoza.
With Spinoza, if he's going, I don't think Spinoza from what I've seen and read, I don't think Spinoza is a stickler on this, but it's interesting to me to understand this from the idea of how, like, if you were to think of this from the perspective of God, God would be the substance. Now, the substance has attributes, and the attributes can't ever really understand the substance, but they are substance. And it's funny, sometimes I have these thoughts about how humans, we think in terms of like, oh, there could be a God, or we say that there is a God, or what we say that there is not, whatever, right? We all imply that there is an agency to the creation of this place, even though we can never really fully ascend to that particular station. But why do we think of it in that way? Especially when from the perspective of our own knowledge, we can never really understand or prove it. So it's always going to be conjecture or speculation to some degree, which is a limit on knowledge, and it's a limit on our power.
Well, he does distinguish, I think we came across this at one point, two kinds of causes, right? So there is the, I think he called it transitive or transitive probably, causes, which are, I mean, I tend to think of it as the billiard ball causation, you know, kind of the external type of cause and effect relation. But then he talks about this other kind, he calls it the immanent cause. And that seems, I mean, I wonder if that may be connected with this internal relation that Nick was bringing up today. And it seems like maybe with this third kind of knowledge, somehow we rise. I think this is, we were having a discussion about to this effect at one point, that we can somehow rise to the sense of an immanent causality, right? Like the way in which God permeates everything as the substance of everything, you know, and it's something kind of bordering on the, I mean, I want to say the mystical. That's probably not a good term to use with a rationalist philosopher, but you know, something maybe ineffable, or maybe, you know, at least out of the ordinary.
Alex, could I try and
Yeah,
answer
please.
that?
Yeah.
The I think there's an important distinction to be drawn between determinism and necessitarianism. The Spinoza is both a determinist and a necessitarian. As a determinist, he says that particular things are the result of infinite chains of cause and effect. And as such, it's not possible for us ever to grasp fully or adequately the causal sequence. But he also says that things are necessary in the sense that they could not be different, they could not be other than they actually are. And my understanding is that this is what he's driving at when he says that God is the immanent cause of everything. That there is a direct relation between God and the manifestations
Patrick.
of particular things.
Patrick, is that referred to as panentheism?
Well, it could be simply the principle of sufficient reason, which simply says that that there is a sufficient reason or adequate explanation for why things are exactly as they are, why they could not possibly be other than they are, why they are necessary. And my guess, okay, my current reading of Spinoza is that this is what he is driving at with the third kind of knowledge. Okay, that it is actually possible for us to realize the necessity of things, of our situations, of every circumstance in our lives. It is possible for us to see that they could not be different.
It seems to be something of the order of an intuitive kind of knowledge, maybe something that goes beyond.
Well, this is what I'm suggesting is that this may be the right way to understand what he means by intuitive knowledge. Okay, why he's distinguishing it from the second kind of knowledge, which is essentially just causal determinism. Well, we'll have fun trying to sort that out in the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, thanks everyone. I have to get going. Great meeting.
Okay, good night.
I was just going to say, it's been such
Have
a
a good
treat,
night, Alex.
Alex, the host in the meeting, contributing to the discussion. Just wanted to let you know that, Alex.
Do you mean the earlier?
He left already? Oh, there
Jimmy,
you are.
no. Do you mean the earlier meeting, the existentialism meeting that we were? We had earlier?
To see you at someone else's meeting and contributing and involved in the discussion is a treat for me.
Yeah. Well, it's a great discussion here. So I'm learning a lot
But
in this meeting.
I really enjoy listening to you and all. And I find that it's a treat to have your host, you the host, being in a meeting, someone else's meeting. It's nice.
Yeah, good to see you too, Jenny.
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you very much, Nick. That was a good presentation, and I'm going to call it a night now. So everyone can just carry on as long as you like. I'm just going to let the recording continue. So just carry on as long as you like, and I'll see you next time. Okay. So have a good night, everybody.
Okay,
Thanks very much.
Good night. Nick, is there anything else we need to discuss about next week? I think if you can sort of cover the material that Wilson talks about, that would be great.
That sounds good.
Good. Yeah. Okay then. So I'll say good night, everybody. Bye bye.
Okay,
Yeah,
good
see you
night.
next
Thank
time.
you.
Bye.
Good night.
Bye-bye.